She was only doing her job, carrying plates, refilling glasses, moving quietly through the room like she always did. To most, she was invisible, the kind of person people never stopped to notice. But on that night, one man did notice, and not for the reasons you might think. He was a CEO dressed in power and pride, speaking in a language he assumed she couldn't understand. The words slipped from his mouth, sharp and mocking, wrapped in laughter he thought was private. He believed she was too small to fight back, too unimportant to matter. But he was wrong. What happened next wasn't just a clash between a powerful man and a waitress. It was something far bigger, a moment that peeled back the mask of arrogance and exposed a truth too many still face. In seconds, the room shifted. The laughter stopped, and the man who thought he held all the power suddenly found himself silenced. The question is, how did one young woman, overlooked and underestimated, turn humiliation into a moment that no one in that room would ever forget? Her name was Amara. To most of the regulars at the high-end restaurant, she was simply the waitress. But behind the uniform, behind the polite smile she wore for every table, there was a young woman with dreams much bigger than the trays she carried. She was working her way through college, balancing late-night shifts with early morning classes, determined to carve out a future where her intelligence, not her appearance, defined her. The restaurant was no ordinary place. It was the kind of establishment where the walls glistened with polished marble, where conversations were whispered in foreign languages, and where business deals worth millions were signed over glasses of champagne. For Amara, it was a job that paid the bills, but it was also a window into a world that reminded her of how invisible she could feel. Most nights passed the same way. She moved from table to table, unnoticed except when a glass needed filling or a plate needed clearing. She had learned to blend in, to let comments slide, to pretend she didn't hear the murmurs that hinted at something more than impatience. But deep down, she felt them. The subtle looks, the dismissive tones, the way some guests acted as though her very presence was an inconvenience. Still, Amara carried herself with quiet dignity. She kept her head high, her mind focused on the bigger picture, because this wasn't her final destination, just one stop on the way to something greater. That night, however, the usual rhythm of clinking silverware and hushed conversations would shift. At a corner table, a man of influence and authority entered the room, a man who believed his wealth gave him the right to say anything to anyone. Amara noticed him immediately, not because she sought his attention, but because of the way the air seemed to change around him. People laughed louder at his jokes, leaned closer to his words, and watched his every move. She didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, his attention would fall directly on her. And in a way she could never have anticipated, that moment would test her strength, her voice, and her very sense of self. What started as an ordinary evening of service was about to turn into something extraordinary, an encounter that would shake the room and leave everyone questioning what they had just witnessed. The night had started smoothly enough. Amara moved through the dining room with practiced grace, balancing plates with ease and keeping her smile steady. She had served countless tables before, business executives, tourists, and politicians, but there was something different about the man at the corner table. His presence carried weight, the kind that made others lean in when he spoke. His suit was sharp, his watch gleamed under the chandelier, and the people around him hung on every word as if their approval depended on it. For Amara, he was just another customer. She approached his table politely, asked for their drink orders, and walked away with the same calm composure she carried with everyone. But when she returned with their wine, she caught something unusual. A glance exchanged between the man and his colleagues, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, and then a sentence spoken in French. Amara's hands tightened around the tray. She didn't let it show, but she understood every word. She had studied the language for years, her fluency a secret most of her co-workers didn't even know. And what she heard was not just careless banter, it was mocking, cruel, directed at her as though she were too insignificant to notice. The words stung like a slap. They reduced her to an object, something to be laughed at, a shadow in her own workspace. The laughter that followed burned in her ears, growing louder than the music in the background, louder than the clinking of glasses around her. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the crowd of servers moving about the room. But she couldn't. She was trapped in that moment, standing with the tray in her hands, knowing every second stretched her humiliation further. Still, she did what she had always done. She kept her composure. She placed the drinks on the table, nodded politely, and turned to leave. But she heard it again. Another remark in French, louder this time. His voice carried across the table, and once more laughter followed. He wasn't just mocking her. He was putting on a performance, showing off for his companions at her expense. Her heart pounded. She had endured rude customers before, endured the subtle looks that made her feel out of place. But this was different. This wasn't silence or dismissal. This was deliberate, calculated disrespect, and it was public. Every instinct told her to walk away, to finish the shift quietly and let it go. She needed this job. Rent was due, tuition was looming, and losing her income wasn't an option. Yet something deep inside her refused to shrink this time. It was as if every unspoken slight she had endured had gathered in that moment, pressing against her chest, demanding release. The tension only grew as she continued serving their table. Each time she approached, another remark slipped out. Each time laughter followed. The other servers noticed. Some looked away, too nervous to intervene. Others exchanged glances, pity in their eyes, but no one said a word. The room carried on, the atmosphere light and elegant, except for the storm building inside Amara. And then, the breaking point. As she cleared their appetizer plates, the CEO leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with arrogance. He made another comment in French, one sharper than the rest, laced with condescension that left no doubt he was mocking her intelligence, her very existence. The table erupted in laughter. Amara froze. The tray trembled slightly in her hands. The weight of humiliation pressed so heavily that for a moment she couldn't breathe. She could feel every eye in the room that dared to glance her way, waiting to see if she would crumble or endure. But deep down, a shift had begun. She realized something powerful. The very language he thought shielded him was the one she had mastered. Every word, every insult, every sneer. She had understood it all. And with that realization came a surge of strength she hadn't felt before. She placed the tray down gently, straightened her back, and looked at him, not with anger, but with steady, unflinching resolve. He didn't notice at first. He laughed again, his voice carrying across the room. But his laughter was about to be cut short. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversation slowed. The music faded into the background. Amara stood at the edge of a decision that could change everything. Stay silent and keep her job, or speak up and reclaim her dignity. And in that silence, as her heart pounded against her ribs, she knew, whatever happened next, she would not let herself be invisible anymore. The laughter still echoed in her ears, sharp and merciless, as if every sound was meant to carve away at her dignity. Amara stood frozen for only a breath, the tray still trembling in her hands. But then, with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed, she set it down and lifted her gaze. The CEO was still laughing, leaning back in his chair like a king surrounded by loyal subjects. He believed the show was his to command, that she was nothing more than a prop in his performance. The people around the table played along, chuckling nervously, complicit in the spectacle. And then Amara spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, and fluent, in perfect French. Every word he had thrown at her, every insult, every cruel joke, she returned with clarity and precision, turning his mockery into a mirror that reflected directly back at him. The shift was instant. The table fell silent. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations nearby stilled, as if the entire restaurant had turned its head to witness the moment. The CEO's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed, confusion flashing first, then disbelief. He had assumed she wouldn't understand, that his cruelty was hidden safely behind the barrier of language. But there was no barrier. There never had been. Amara didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out. She didn't need to. The power was in her composure, in the elegance of her words, in the way she stood tall despite the weight pressing against her chest. Each sentence struck harder than a shout ever could. Each phrase stripped away his arrogance piece by piece. The room felt heavier with every word she spoke. Guests who moments before had been indifferent now stared with wide eyes, caught between discomfort and awe. Some shifted uneasily in their seats, realizing they had laughed along without knowing the cost. Others looked at her with quiet admiration, as though they were seeing her for the first time. For the CEO, there was nowhere to hide. hide. The mask of power that had shielded him cracked under the pressure of exposure. The language he had used as a weapon had been reclaimed, turned against him with a dignity he could never mimic. His face flushed, his jaw tightened, but his silence betrayed the truth. He had lost control, and in that silence, Amara stood taller than ever. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't the invisible figure carrying plates in the background. In that moment, she was undeniable, a voice that demanded to be heard. The laughter was gone. The room was still, and the man who believed he held all the power was left staring at the one person he thought he could humiliate without consequence. It was more than a reply. It was a declaration, and as the last of her words echoed across the room, one question lingered heavy in the air. What happens when the truth leaves no room to hide? The silence that followed Amara's words was unlike anything the restaurant had ever known. For a moment, the room itself seemed to stop breathing. Conversations had ended. Glasses sat untouched. Even the soft background music felt distant, like it dared not intrude on the tension that had filled every corner. The CEO, a man who had walked into the restaurant cloaked in power and confidence, now sat small in his chair. His arrogance had dissolved under the weight of exposure. For once, he had no clever retort, no easy laughter to summon. He had been stripped of the illusion that his words were harmless. And worse, he realized everyone in that room had witnessed his humiliation. But this story wasn't really about him. It never was. Amara stood quietly, her heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the rush of finally claiming her voice. She hadn't planned for this moment. She hadn't rehearsed what to say. Yet somehow, every word had landed with the force of truth. And the truth was undeniable. She gathered the empty plates and walked away, not with bitterness, but with dignity. Some diners lowered their eyes, ashamed of their silence. Others gave her small nods of respect, gestures that carried more weight than words. The manager, usually quick to defend wealthy customers, did not step in. Perhaps he, too, had realized that silence would only deepen the shame already lingering in the air. By the end of the night, whispers had spread beyond that single table. The story was already leaving the confines of the dining room, carried by those who had seen it unfold. And though the CEO would go home nursing a bruised ego, Amara left with something far greater, the knowledge that her voice could no longer be ignored. Still, the impact wasn't only hers to carry. What happened that night revealed something bigger, something that stretched far beyond polished tables and fine wine. It revealed the casual cruelty that so often hides behind jokes, behind language, behind the assumption that those with less power will never fight back. It exposed how racism doesn't always come in the form of shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes dressed in laughter, cloaked in arrogance, disguised as something harmless. But its impact is no less devastating. For Amara, that night became a turning point. It was a reminder that silence protects no one, that dignity can be reclaimed even in the most humiliating of moments. And for those who witnessed it, the lesson was unforgettable. Words matter, and the way we choose to use them reveals who we truly are. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Amara's story is not unique. There are countless others who endure the same dismissive looks, the same whispered comments, the same cruel laughter in spaces where they deserve respect. Most moments don't end with public silence. Most don't end with the powerful being held accountable. And yet, every single one of them leaves scars that can last a lifetime. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they are rare, but because they are far too common. They remind us that even in rooms filled with wealth and privilege, injustice doesn't disappear. It hides in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to call it out. As viewers, we are left with a choice. Do we look away, laugh along, or stay silent when we see injustice unfold? Or do we find the courage, like Amara did, to stand, to speak, to reclaim the dignity that no one has the right to take away? The night ended with Amara walking home under the glow of streetlights, the cool air wrapping around her like a reminder that she had faced the storm and endured. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was proof that a single voice, spoken at the right time, could silence an entire room. And so her story lingers, not just in the memory of those who watched it happen, but in ours too. Because in a world still haunted by racism, still scarred by injustice, the question remains, how many more voices will it take before silence is no longer the norm?